name is Ali Ramji, and I'm the managing editor of The Exchange. And it's my pleasure and privilege to welcome you all to this panel discussion hosted by Africa Forum. Today, we shall be speaking on the topic of technology for sustainable work, understanding the gig economy and digital platforms in Africa. As we're aware, the future of work isn't in the growth of full time formal sector jobs. It's rather on people working multiple gigs in somewhat formal entities. This is our and it will be for the foreseeable future. While the sector of the gig economy has had a boost during the pandemic, many other areas of this important economic sector have suffered during the last year. Recognizing the impact of COVID 19 on Africa and the gig economy, it makes it important for us to assess the status of the digital gig work, thus raising questions and concerns on how the digital world can contribute to the economic and human development in the continent. On this subject, we have two esteemed panelists today. Miss Amolo Ngueno is the CEO of BFA Global. She's based in Nairobi and runs the company globally. Her recent areas of interest include the changing nature of work in developing countries with the growth of the digital economy, harnessing technology, and providing micro entrepreneurs the wherewithal in the financial and technical tools for growth. She served also as the managing director of the Digital Divide Kenya, a social enterprise that provides data and research services to companies and governments while hiring young people from disadvantaged backgrounds and supporting their higher education ambitions. We have also Dr. Louise Bezenhout. She's a research officer for Fair Work South Africa at Sitanda in the Department of Information Systems at the University of Cape Town. She's been a research fellow at the Institute of Science, Innovation and Society from 2017 to 2021 and has worked on the changing ecologies of knowledge and action. Welcome, panelists. As we look at digitization in Africa, Amalo, you are someone who supports the role of innovation, given that you're currently a key player behind the East African startup scene, or rather, digital innovation in the sector on the continent. While you have seen as what you have seen as one of the most fun aspects that is driving the entrepreneurial scene across Africa. And what can you tell our audience today about the burst of entrepreneurship and innovation, specifically through digital platforms on the continent?
Thanks, Ali. I think this is a really exciting sector. As you mentioned, we run a fintech accelerator called the Catalyst Fund that is not only in East Africa, but also in Nigeria and South Africa. So we have interesting Pan-African perspective. Um, the background is the mobile money innovation, which was really the big underlying transformation in the digital economy in Africa in the past 15 years. And um, in case there's anybody who is not aware of this, this is where you can use your phone to transact financial transactions instantly. And it's Africa is the leading continent for using mobile money. And as soon as this mobile money infrastructure came to exist, which started in Kenya with M-Pesa in 2006, um, there's been innovation on top of it, especially for micro and small businesses. So it's been the backbone of a huge flourishing of innovative ideas and companies. And subsequently, we've seen the growth of the pay-as-you-go solar industry, which has enabled solar power for hundreds of thousands of households who were not reached by the grid. And we're still seeing innovation around e-commerce that is related to being able to pay instantly and at a distance with mobile money. So it's been a very fertile innovation infrastructure in most African countries over the past 15 years. And this has been extremely exciting for me personally. And I think for our accelerator and for everybody who's watching the continent, that the opportunity that digital technology affords to potentially get on a faster and even leapfrogging development track.
Thank you. It's interesting that you end up talking about the burst of digital payments and leapfrogging. And I know that this is something that many individuals are now jumping on this bandwagon in Africa. Dr. Basenhout, for those individuals who are seeking opportunities in the digital arena, what would you say are some of the key trends in this sector, and what could some of the youth and those interested in this arena do to take advantage of the digital domain? But more importantly, while we see this growth and in this burst in mobile money and opportunities in the digital world, what should they do in order to protect themselves? And this is more about an individual taking it upon themselves to provide a service in terms of protecting themselves.
That's a very interesting question. Thanks, Ali. I think for the youth in Africa, particularly gig work, is becoming a really exciting opportunity. We're not only seeing the evolution of a huge number of platforms, we're also seeing a decrease in the price of data, which is making it more accessible and more affordable for individuals to get into gig work. I think in terms of protecting oneself as a gig worker, um, I would say one of the most important things that isn't particularly well discussed is a proper understanding of the contracts that gig workers are signing with the platforms, proper understanding of the occupational risks that they will have to undertake as part of their gig work. Um, and now that we're seeing more than one platform being represented in each sector of the gig economy, so more than one e-hailing platform, more than one food delivery platform, it's offering individuals going into gig work the opportunity to make informed decisions, to compare practices and worker relations on different platforms, and to start choosing the ones that they want to work with and support that really do take their security and safety interests at heart. I would say at this point for young Africans going into gig work, it's super exciting to see that they now have the opportunity to select and thus put user pressure onto platforms to start behaving better.
Okay. It's interesting that you said that they have an opportunity of making informed. Now, we know that last year the pandemic took off, and it took a major toll on all economies globally. But on the continent, we saw significant lockdowns, and no one was able to leave their homes. In some countries, it was just impossible to do anything, and the the price that people paid, they found these opportunities. But during this time, we saw unique global outputs in e-commerce to various different types of online services. How could and I'm directing this question to Amalo. How people protect themselves, but at the same time, if you can explain a little bit about what happened during this period and about some of the new initiatives that were undertaken and what some of the things that you were doing, because I'm sure that there is a tie-in between what Dr. Louise is doing and what you're doing as well.
Yeah, so obviously the COVID period, which is continuing in Africa with such low vaccination rates so far, um, it was, as it was worldwide, a shock, and the lockdowns were very severe in many countries. And because of that, as we've seen in the rest of the world, the nascent e-commerce sector has received a significant boost. I think research has shown that especially young men have been able to jump on the e-commerce and gig work delivery bandwagon during the pandemic. Women have not been as able to do so and have seen their earnings even fall. Although I'm sure that people working in the digital economy have had less impact on their earnings than those who haven't been able to work at all, or who have had really severe declines in their incomes because of the pandemic. So we've seen really big gains for the e-commerce industry, and I think it's a positive sign that the economies are resilient and that people can adjust move into new types of work when it's necessary, and also that the digital challenges, and we see this, for instance, we're doing a project in Rwanda to help micro enterprises and workers access digital platforms. And it is not easy. It's not just that, oh, I wake up in the morning and I decide to become a delivery driver, or I decide to put my enterprise online. There are a lot of obstacles for people who are new smartphone users, who have low capacity smartphones, where data is very expensive, and it requires very often a person to help you through the process. And we've seen this with the whole mobile money revolution, that was possible because of agents who are now everywhere, and they help you to get online. So one of the things we think is extremely valuable in the digital transition to digital is having human helpers and guides to help people get online. I think you asked a question about, and Louise had alluded to it, that not all digital jobs are created equal. And where people have a choice, it's certainly, it's to their advantage to see what the choices are. I think mostly people are not knowledgeable about their choices. They typically would join a particular platform because somebody they know has already done so and succeeded. Um, and not all platforms treat their workers equally. I think we've seen a number of the platforms, especially the locally derived ones, that are attempting to improve worker conditions by providing things like insurance or credit. But I think we're still not clear what's the best way to regulate or supervise the platforms in a way that allows them to grow and provide benefits to their members and users, but also to respect or improve the conditions of work. And maybe just to remind everybody that the other conditions of work is the informal sector. So the person who's hooked themselves onto a gig work platform, their other option is not to go into the formal sector and have a regular benefit filled, protection filled formal job. That 80% or more of workers in African countries work in the informal sector. And for them, to a large extent, even the not as great platform work offers better opportunities and benefits and pay than their other option in the informal sector.
Okay. And Dr. Louise, I mean, your concentration is I mean, a lot of it is focused on this sort of, protection of workers and fair work in the digital domain. But with the burst of, this newfound sort of opportunity on the continent, we do see various types of entrepreneurial models. And like, Amalo, you mentioned that, if your friend sees something, then you may end up doing it based on their success. But given that perspective, but also the fact that this gig economy is growing, and we see entities like Uber and Bolt and many others across the continent, opening. Um, they're reaping the rewards from many of the individuals who are signing up to partake in this new era of work. What could you say about workers' rights in this arena, given the fact that you work in it? But what should governments do in order to protect, the service providers?
Thanks for that. I mean, that's quite a huge question. So I'm going to break it
Mhm.
down. I think that what we're definitely advocating for in the Fair Work Foundation is to try and stop what is commonly termed a race to the bottom, that the competition between platforms will increasingly undercut the prices paid to workers, and that they will encourage workers to take increasingly risky working conditions in order to save money. So we're definitely seeing platforms in Africa poised on that, and definitely some platforms are dealing with it better than others. However, what we are seeing as well is that there is a lot of discussion between workers on platforms as to working conditions and their rights as workers on those platforms. As Amalo mentioned, communication between workers is incredibly important. In Fair Work, in our interviews, we find regular evidence of very strong WhatsApp groups, very strong discussion groups between workers, where they're really discussing the working conditions of the platform, how the platform is responding to their concerns, and so forth. And I think recognizing that not only are the workers very engaged in their rights as workers and the conditions that they're working in, but also that they have these existing networks, it provides a great opportunity for governments to really start thinking about how to facilitate worker representation for these platforms. At the moment, very few platforms recognize collective bargaining. Very few platforms have opportunities for workers as collectives to raise concerns and engage with discussions with platform management. And in order for the platform sector and the gig work to really progress and to see better working conditions, I feel that it's very important for governments to start creating opportunities and trade unions to start creating opportunities where platforms can be engaged with on a collective basis.
Related to that, do you feel that there should be, more regulation on in this era? And are there examples that you can take from perhaps the West or the industrialized world and adapt them to an African context? Because what you're doing right now is we're creating opportunities, but then if the regulation comes, then it'll deter any sort of new platform from even growing. Wouldn't you say so?
I don't necessarily agree with that wholesale. I do think
Okay.
regulating in terms of collective representation would not necessarily deter platform development and platform growth. And indeed, in South Africa, we're seeing a number of the local platforms um, who are South African developed and South African led, being quite open to discussions about collective representation. And I think that's a really interesting perspective that while some of these larger platforms are perhaps not in a position because of the multi regulatory landscape in which they work, not ready or able to engage with collective representation. Platforms that are working within a specific country that have a very strong connection to their user communities, both the service providers and the consumers, they seem to be a little bit more prepared and a little bit more aware of the need for collective representation. So um, I do think better guidance and better policy could actually lead to a growth in particularly national platforms who really are well integrated in responding to collective concerns.
Okay.
I want to
And
support,
yeah, go
sorry,
ahead.
I want to support Louise's point. I think what we've seen definitely in the digital credit aspect is first, people had no credit and they were desperate when they wanted a small amount of money for a meal or school fees or a hospital visit. And then digital credit became available through the banking system, and people loved it, and millions of people took it up, and it was wonderful. And then almost within minutes, there were hundreds of digital credit providers who have extremely high interest rates and terms that one could consider abusive. And the governments are now struggling with what's the best way to regulate that sector. And I think what we see is that all of this innovation is wonderful, and it's great that people can gain new livelihoods and new opportunities through the platforms. But I don't think that we should assume that therefore no regulation is possible or good. I think I don't think we're necessarily at the point yet when we can say everything's gone too far, but having an eye to the question of collective organization by workers and potentially, I think, other types of regulations, such as that platforms maybe need to provide access to national health insurance programs through their platforms, or there are a variety of probably slowly increasing as the sector develops, that regulation that is going to be needed. I also think we need to beware of bringing in models from the West because exactly of the point that the informal sector is the dominant employment option for most people, whereas the model of formal sector structure and regulation that is common in the West really can't just be imported wholesale and put into the platform universe. So I think we have to forge a new course, and it's an exciting moment for regulators as well as for innovators and workers.
Absolutely. If I can
Okay.
just jump in on that as well, I totally agree, and I think that um, what we're seeing, particularly with the smaller platforms in Africa, is that obviously because they're startups, they don't necessarily have the capacity to invest huge amounts of money in legal counsel, in developing their own structures. So it leaves them in a situation where either they're adopting models from existing platforms in the West, which aren't necessarily particularly reflective of the African context, or they're just trying to do the best that they can. A lot of platform owners are quite philanthropically minded and quite positive about trying to enact social change, but without proper either policy or guidance documents that break down what is recognized to be an incredibly complicated regulatory and legal landscape, it's very difficult to expect platforms to suddenly just have the correct processes in place. And I think we do need to do more, particularly for platforms developed on the African continent, to provide legal counsel and legal advice on how best to support workers when they start thinking about how to design their platforms.
Okay. Um, Related to that question, I mean, then my next question would be um, for both of you, but Amolo, um, what sort of with the changing models of doing business, and we've seen, you just mentioned about, these micro loan sort of programs, but looking from mobile banking to online service providers, what would you say are some of the key aspects that individuals, and for that matter companies, to possess in order for them to stay ahead of the game, and be innovative enough that meets the taste of individuals, but then also tries to protect the worker? Because I'm trying to understand something right now, that we're looking at worker protection, but at the same time looking at innovation. And yes, everything works together, but usually when new platforms are created, the goal is for monetization. And if you're looking at monetization as your first and foremost fundamental, base of why I want to XYZ application or platform, then you tend to leave aside worker protection and worker rights. And you give that opportunity for an individual to sign on. But, in looking at that, what could you say would be perhaps some of the aspects that allow a company to really take off? But then now, because we're talking about this subject, for them to also stay in the game and protect workers' rights.
So I think it's not true that the sole and only purpose of many of these platforms is in fact monetization. I mean, it's obviously their corporate existence, but I think we really see that many of the platforms have a partial social purpose. So they say the problem in the market that I observe is unemployment, and I think that motorcycle taxi is going to be a way to address the unemployment issue while also creating a platform that has significant growth. So I think their market analysis very often actually starts from a social problem. The problem is people don't have electricity, and therefore I'm going to create a way for people to pay that will enable them to have it. So I think firstly the naked capitalism is a little tempered in most of these cases, and it has to be because the population are they have so many fundamental problems that solving some of those fundamental problems will in fact, if you're successful, lead to commercial success. And I think I don't think that the platforms in general are opposed to better worker rights and protections. I think it's also there could be costs associated with introducing new benefits or protections, and sometimes yes, those would be sacrificed to the growth or income imperative. But I think more we see people struggling with how best to actually offer something that is valuable. We've worked with several platforms who've tried to introduce credit products and insurance products, and very often workers don't take them up. And that's one of the reasons why we're working with them, is to help to understand why is it that people are not taking up this product, which should, on the face of it, be good for them, and that the platform has introduced because they want workers to have better benefits. And sometimes that just relates back to the basic market question of know your customer and what does the customer want. And sometimes it has to do with the complexity. Insurance products, for instance, are notoriously difficult for people to understand as first-time users. So I think we actually do see platforms often making an effort to have better benefits anyway. Worker protections, maybe. I think it's still a difficult. The balance is not necessarily easy and obvious, and there's a first recommendation to do this or that. Obviously, there's a bit more of a balance between the interest of the platform and the interest of the worker. But I think, as Louise had mentioned, that we're likely to see more organization by workers, and we see a lot. There have been numerous strikes by the taxi industry, and they are lobbying governments to put in certain rules and protections. But usually, so far, they have not been very effective. And I think one of the challenges in the digital world is actually organizing, because the rest of your coworkers are people you don't know, you don't meet. The common cause of all working in one location is missing.
Okay. Related to that, then, and you see, I have an interesting perspective in looking at it from the notion of, the bottom line. Yes, there may be an ESG perspective in looking at sustainability and looking at, how it's adding value to, the society and so forth. But sometimes these new apps may end up adding more harm than good. Okay, and then one example is this one about these high interest micro loan programs. Okay, because I know that there are some certain concerns in Kenya, which is where I reside half my time. And what, when you look at some of these sort of issues, what would you say to the individual signing up on this? And at the same time, what would you say, or what advice could you end up giving to um, a potential worker to say, read the, because this is a common, sort of a common practice. Even when I end up downloading an application, I do know that they're going to suck all the data from my phone. All right. I know that, in order for me to use it, I have to abide by their policies. So, perhaps you could talk about, the policy side of it, but and Louise, perhaps, you can touch on what we could do to better educate the worker. Well, maybe you could talk about, the policy side of things, because I know that, BFA is involved in looking at this aspect of, protecting the consumer who's received the loan, correct?
Yeah. So I think, yes, I think it's actually not at all straightforward to know what the right regulation is. And you mentioned the digital lending, that people do need credit. So we cannot just say, okay, I'm going to do away with the opportunity to have digital loans. But at the same time, there are numerous providers with very extreme interest rates, and really the same few fewer minority of people who get into a problem of extreme over indebtedness where they're just borrowing from multiple lenders to pay the other lender. So I think the consumer advice is to tread carefully with all of these new opportunities. Nobody reads the terms and conditions. We all know that. We don't read them on our phone. And knowing how to understand what you're getting into is actually not easy at all. I think one of the things, and we've seen some regulation like this in India and some other countries, is it needs to be as clear as possible. I think there's the standardized annual percentage rate for that US lenders have to use, for example. And the most important terms have to be clear and highlighted. But people, we're all struggling with how to understand what is happening with our data and even with our money in the digital universe. I think the fact that so it cries out for regulation and for customer. I want to say customer education, but I don't mean that in the form of lectures, but just the terms, the conditions, the key factors to be as clear as possible, and the consumer to be a little careful, that they understand. And possibly, we discussed that. How do people know what they're getting into? Well, they know through their friends. And so at minimum, I would say if you're a consumer and you're thinking of attaching yourself to a platform or taking on a digital product, ask your friends who are already using it about the downsides of it, not just why it's so wonderful. And then, yeah, this digital world is with us, and we're and regulation will always lag the real world, and it has to. So we're probably in a period that may last for quite a while still, where there's all kind of innovation going on, and regulation is going to lag.
Okay. And again, that's but Dr. Louise, when you look at workers signing up, and again, they're not going to read the fine print, but they get into a situation where it clearly indicates that they're not necessarily going to be protected for X, Y, and Z. And related to that, also, with these sense of work from home, what would you advise people or individuals wanting to get into this sort of new domain, um, and with these different types of rewards coming in, where and one government may not necessarily see what you're earning because you're getting paid in mobile money, you know how would you end up recommending or giving your recommendations to someone who is keen on joining a platform, but they're not necessarily going to read the fine print?
So, well, definitely fair contracts is one of the key pillars of our fair work assessments, and we take it very seriously. As Amalo said, and as you've said, often we will see workers not taking the time to read the terms and conditions, or as we found out quite a lot, that they have actually been interested in reading the terms and conditions, but they're not written in a way that is accessible and understandable to workers who perhaps don't have a background in high-level contract law and things like that. So in contrast to working with individuals, we've actually been working quite a lot with platforms to try and encourage them to make their terms and conditions more accessible and understandable to their workers. We have some examples of some South African platforms who've really taken this on board and have written out a layperson guide to their terms and conditions that accompanies their terms and conditions online. And we found that to be very helpful and very productive for workers who are actually interested in. One of the other things we've seen very problematic in many gig platforms is that workers only get access to the terms and conditions through the app. So if the worker is blocked from the app, they're actually blocked from accessing the terms and conditions, which can make it very difficult to sort out any sort of dispute. In terms of advice to the workers, I would agree with what's been said. I think it's very important to try and read it. It's important to have a look online and see what discussions are going on around these platforms, and if there are certain things that keep being raised, certain issues that keep being raised that aren't being resolved. Talking to friends about their experiences is very useful, but until platforms actually start taking terms and conditions more seriously in terms of making them accessible and understandable to their users, I feel that that's all we've got to rely on as gig platform workers at the moment.
Okay. Now I'm going to end up shifting the subject matter slightly. When we look at this concept of work from home, we see that you mentioned that the cost of data is decreasing, and we see that the rise of growing economies on the continent are increasing more and more. What could both of you actually say to how entrepreneurs could actually reap these rewards, and what could companies actually do to leverage this power of the gig revolution that's creating this future of work on the continent?
I think there are two sides of the possibility of working from home, and one is available to relatively higher educated people who have a computer and good internet at home, which is online work. So doing jobs for people elsewhere on your computer. It's been rapidly growing in most across the continent. But it is limited to that relatively small number of people who have the educational and equipment, educational abilities and equipment to do it. Um, the other part is the e-commerce, and I think this is actually a huge aspect, possibly the bigger of the digital work revolution, where even the smallest micro business that you're running from your house can improve their sales on e-commerce, not just the platforms as we know them, the Amazon or Jumia, but more so what we see is that people are using social media, especially Instagram, Facebook, and WhatsApp for promoting and selling, and to the degree that that is taking payments on mobile money. So this is probably the we're just seeing the early part of what could be a major transformation in incomes and opportunities for people who are running micro businesses.
Oh, absolutely. I would totally agree. And I think one thing that I've noticed during COVID, which has been really heartening, is the increasing digital visibility of African businesses. So not even before engaging in e-commerce, actually starting to get a digital presence, have a website, have a map location and things like that. It's been really heartening because then we're starting to actually see business on the ground being reflected online, which allows people to make better and more informed choices about what they're going to be doing. So I think that's really great. In terms of taking advantage of the working from home and the digital revolution, one of the things that I think has been really promising in South Africa is the advent of zero rating platforms, particularly educational platforms. So to enable, for those of you who are not familiar with the term zero rating, to be able to access educational platforms without having a data cost associated with it. And that has really revolutionized education, online education in South Africa, and has become a really important way of decreasing barriers that would come with lack of money for data or lack of advanced ICT technologies. And I feel that if Africa is going to really take this work from home and particularly the educate from home seriously, we need to start thinking about how we can roll out zero rating across the continent to make sure that the price of data is not a barrier to accessing certain key platforms. And while the price of data is going down in many countries, for a number of countries in Africa, the cost of a gig of data is well over $20. So it makes things like this conference, for example, quite a financial undertaking for those who perhaps are already vulnerable because of their financial situations.
I'm glad that you spoke about the cost of data, and I think that over time, as telecom infrastructures increase on the continent, we are going to end up seeing data prices decreasing. Otherwise, there will be an uproar in numerous other areas. But having said that, and looking at the future, what should entrepreneurs primarily look at when marketing their services? Because now we're seeing that there are a slew of different entrepreneurs coming online to really look at acquiring that potential customer. What would be the differentiating factor? And I want to address this to you, Amalo. What would be the differentiating factor that would enable them to stand out, not just in Africa, but globally? Because we see this, and I look at this, and I look at Upwork, for example, or I look at Fiverr, or any of People Per Hour, any of these sort of freelance sort of platforms where you have individuals educated, but the tendency from, let's say, some of the Western countries is to choose individuals that perhaps come from maybe Eastern Europe, or perhaps come from some in North America, but rarely individuals from Africa. And what could they actually do, not necessarily on those platforms, but just in general, to make them stand out?
I think it's actually very difficult. I think the tendency that you mentioned, it starts with online work. Buyers actually buy mostly from their own country. And then secondly, they buy from the places that they consider familiar or which are known to them to do that particular service. The Philippines being a big provider of online work, for example, someone in Europe might be more familiar with that than with Nigeria. So I think it is very difficult. And even amongst the people who are successful, and there are numerous thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who are successful, but I think we see that there are few people who are able to demonstrate a high skills in customer service as well as in their technical skill. And there are relatively few of them. In our research, we see that often they then go and hire sub workers who work under their name, and they handle the customer service. So you find, and which is its own interesting corporate organization, but you find people who are successful on those platforms. Typically, it's not because they alone are successful. They're good at customer service. They're good at promoting their image into the platform, and then they often hire people behind to get the work done. I think a big concern in all of those platforms is, as Louise had mentioned, the race to the bottom on price. And it's very difficult for an individual who's offering an undifferentiated basic service. The higher the technical input or the skill level required, the more you're able to say, well, I'm especially good at something that sets you apart from everybody else, then the more likely you are to be able to escape from that race to the bottom. But I think it is worth emphasizing that it's probably not technical skills; it's communication skills and presentation skills that allow you to stand out and be different. And the same is true if you're a micro enterprise trying to connect to Jumia or a big international platform like Amazon. You'll be unknown and unseen, and nobody will buy from you unless you're really able to present yourself and your product into that international market. And there's no immediate trick to that. As usual, it's the understanding your customer and understanding your market is what's important. But I think often our African education systems really don't emphasize how important those social and communication skills are. And we produce people with excellent technical skills, but underdeveloped understanding of how important it is to have those soft skills. And that's true even facing
Uh,
their own domestic markets.
Looking
Yes.
at the domestic market in South Africa, Louise, and to interrupt you, I mean, you can answer this question, but I also want you to then touch on, um, given the fact that South Africa is a much more advanced digital environment than most of the other sub-Saharan African countries, what are some potential key takeaways that you see in in South that can be adopted in some of the other emerging economies within the continent. If you could touch on what I mentioned earlier, but also on this subject.
Absolutely. So, I mean, I would agree. I think what Amala was talking about in terms of cloud work, so in terms of the geographically untethered platforms, it is very difficult to prevent a race from the bottom. And it's definitely the soft skills and the kind of personal brand management that is really making individuals who work on those sites successful or not successful. I think this is something that is becoming increasingly recognized within the gig sector. And you are seeing startups and organizations offering personal development. And interestingly, during COVID, Uber partnered with the African Management Academy to provide training for their workers on personal development and kind of personal financial responsibility. So I think it's definitely something that people are starting to take more seriously, and it's definitely something that needs to be better looked at and better supported. Training in personal development. In terms of South Africa, I think one of the things that we're seeing that is really becoming a pathway to success for gig platforms, taking social responsibility as a brand to set yourself apart from other platforms. So you're seeing a lot of South African platforms consciously making a decision towards having a very strong social agenda as integrated into their business model and integrated into their marketing. And I think it's very interesting because they're tapping into very long-standing traditions that we have in South Africa and also around the world. Things like fair trade, or in South Africa, Proudly SA, which is a campaign to encourage people to support and buy from South African businesses. And I think trying to think about that as a way of setting yourself aside and differentiating yourself from the other platforms is a really interesting approach, and perhaps something that could be reproduced across the continent. So, using social responsibility as a way of setting your brand aside from the other more international platforms and competitors, and trying to leverage on that to grow your business.
Okay. Now this is a last question, just before we close. When both of you look at the continent and you see that this potential for e-commerce, the gig economy, where do you see this new sort of this new type of work expanding on the continent? Because on one side we talk about industrialization, on the other side we talk about national development, but on the other side we're also seeing these new opportunities. So perhaps some closing thoughts on where you see the gig economy on the continent over the course of the next decade, and what are some of the smaller challenges to some of the larger challenges that one could potentially foresee.
So I think it's only going to grow, and it's going to be a driver of economic growth and opportunity for the giant number of young people who will be coming into the market over the next 10 years. I think, as we've discussed, the key question is how best to regulate that sector, how to encourage growth while at the same time encouraging responsibility. And I think we're going to see positive and negative steps over the next decades as governments struggle with that. I do think it's an opportunity, as I said from the top, to leapfrog over a long period that might otherwise exist of continued informal only employment as the only option for most young people. So I'm terrifically optimistic that we will see ongoing growth, and that growth will increasingly trend towards better conditions for workers, while at the same time, as the economies grow, better profits for platforms. So I'm optimistic. I'm sure the path is not necessarily going to be straight, and there'll be detours and setbacks, but that overall this is a sector with enormous potential.
And your closing thoughts, Dr. Louise?
Oh, absolutely. I totally agree with what Amala was saying. I think this is a very exciting time to be looking at this sector in Africa, and I think it's only going to grow and it's only going to get better. The thing that I am particularly heartened by is the growth, the concurrent growth of African designed and led platforms with the imposition of international platforms onto the African continent, because I think it shows that there is a kind of local growth that counters what could be seen as a kind of neocolonialism of digital platforms onto the continent. And I think supporting and encouraging African-led platforms is going to be a really important step in getting the digital future that we want on the continent.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Louise. And thank you, Your Africa Forum, for having us on this panel. And we look forward to hearing more about this subject as and more subjects on the role of development on the continent.